climate change in particular is such a clear and present danger that I don't think anybody in Asia needs to be convinced of the importance of mitigating measures being incorporated in the way we run companies and governments and societies. We sitting in Singapore or India are direct witnesses to the rise in sea level, the extreme high temperatures that the summers seem to bring each successive year, to risks of water security from droughts, the risk of salinity starting to eat into crop yield. I mean, those are so clear and present. And again, if one travels or if one just looks around one's own nation, it's so evident that I don't think there are too many climate skeptics here in Asia. And hence, the sort of struggles that we see in the West, where still issues related to the linkage between man-made activities and climate change are somewhat still political hot potatoes. On ESG, the critical issue around the three of those letters is E, the environmental part. I think we can talk about social and governance later, but on the environmental side, there are very few groups of people or governments in Asia that are climate skeptic. Rising sea levels, rising global temperature, water shortage, these are so clear and present in Asia that societies, governments, civil bodies all are fully on board with mitigating measures being the clarion call of the way we run companies, societies, and governments for years and decades of our lifetime ahead. So in this context, Asia is different from the West, particularly the US, where climate change and the link from man-made activity to climate change is still somewhat controversial. There's very little controversy here. But in terms of work needed to mitigate climate change, to transform the way we run our businesses, to transform the way we produce and distribute and consume, we have a long ways to go. Already, however, there are encouraging trends, whether here in Singapore or in India or in China. Tremendous initiatives are being taken to build renewable energy grids, to come up with responsible ways of doing agriculture, to reduce our carbon footprint. And although Asia certainly has not benefited from fossil fuel driven growth with the duration that the West has, and there is some degree of unfairness into Asia having to recalibrate toward the new reality even before getting the full benefit of fossil fuel driven growth, but it is what it is. And I don't think Asian governments are that angst driven that they would refuse to fall in line with the climate change agenda just because they feel that the Western countries benefited more from fossil fuel growth. So the reality is the way we run our economies today is simply unsustainable, and we have to come up with ways to reduce the amount of pollutants in the air. The quality of air is, again, so easily visible into our day-to-day quality of life that nobody in Delhi or Jakarta today has to be convinced that that needs to be reduced. Everybody understands that at the peril of their own health. Similarly, issues related to water shortage or the problem associated with higher temperature having the risk of creating havoc in just about everything that we do, again, is so clear and present here in Asia that I think societal buy-in, individual buy-in, governmental buy-in is already there. Now, are we seeing interesting things? Absolutely. I mean, think about India, which probably did not produce a single solar cell 20 years ago and today is the largest producer of solar cell in the world. Think about China, which appeared to be very skeptical about moving to renewables a decade ago, today is leading the world in renewables. Think about Singapore, tiny dot here in Asia, but still taking the lead in setting standards on taxonomy, on climate change, for lending, for doing business, and creating digital exchanges, creating long-term concrete goals with substantial amount of resource allocation to deal with climate change. So whether it is tiny countries like Singapore or large monoliths like India and China, everywhere we see entrepreneurs, governments beginning to take decisive action. and the trend is encouraging. Of course, we can always say much more needs to be done. We need to have well-functioning carbon exchanges. We need to find better ways to naming and shaming corporations that are brown and force them toward green orientation. Easy to say, hard to do. It is a continent that is developing, not quite developed. There's a lot of imperative and deliverables that governments and societies have. There's a lot of aspiration. We cannot immediately go to the ways with which the world ought to be to live with net zero. That is something that is down the road. Progress will be made. There will always be room for growth and progress. But I think that the first hard steps have been taken. One is the buy-in. I think by and large there is buy-in in Asia. Second is governments leading the way in investment in renewables. I think it's happening everywhere. Third is the entrepreneurial class finding it to be a mission, and that we're seeing everywhere. I think young entrepreneurs today see very little difference between wanting to make a lot of money and wanting to do good. They feel that those two things have no contradiction between the two. They're complementary to some extent, and especially on the areas of climate change. There's a lot of support, there's a lot of financing to be had if you have good ideas. And I'm pleased to see that whether it's in Singapore, in India, or in China, the young entrepreneurs are embracing that with a great deal of energy.